essentially stays intact. The key variables that will shift the demand to the right or to the left are the world economy and obviously the industrial growth, which determines the volume of bulk commodities that are being shipped, the seaborne trade that results from this world economy, obviously the average haul, the ton miles, Mark was talking about that yesterday, various political events, acts of God that may affect the average haul, and last but not least, OPEX, which is also known as direct operating costs. These are the costs that owners need to incur whether the vessel is deployed on a trade or not. So that is a very simple graph. The steep angle reflects the inelasticity that I just talked about. And it essentially can only shift to the right or to the left, depending on the key variables, but the angle remains steep throughout. Now let's move on to supply. Essentially, the shape of supply resembles the hockey stick, hence the name. The key difference between demand in shipping and supply in shipping is that supply operates in two regions. In the region of perfect elasticity and then perfect inelasticity. Which out of the two it's going to be will depend on the fleet utilization. The perfect elasticity is driven by the cost, by the bottom line that we're going to refer to in a second. The perfect inelasticity is a result of the fact that it takes anywhere between 12 to 18 months to build the ship, and at one point of time, when the world runs out of the available fleet, further increases in prices will have no effect on supply whatsoever. So again, as in the case of demand, the shape will stay intact throughout, but it may shift to the right or to the left, depending on, or up and down, depending on three other variables. Scrapping, it's going to shift to the left. Building, it's going to shift to the right. And fleet productivity, I guess, I think I'm missing the OPEX there. And the fleet productivity that can also increase or decrease in supply. And then the operating cost. So let's look a little bit closer at the vessel operating costs. They broadly can be divided between the unavoidable costs and avoidable costs. As long as you own the ship, whether you run it or not, you still have to pay back your loan, you still have to run your office, so there is certain costs that you cannot avoid. What you can avoid is to incur direct operating costs, so you can reduce them by going into layup, or voyage-related costs. Now, I just wanted to give you an example so you get a feel for the range that we're talking about. This is a quote from Executive Ship Management in Singapore, and it essentially gives you an amount of money that it takes to run a 5-year-old bulker. Essentially, the direct operating costs can be divided into three groups. The most significant is the manning cost, crew wages, crew-related costs. Then you have the technical cost, basically whatever it takes to maintain and repair the vessel and dry dock it. And then you have various fees such as manager fee, insurance, etc. And here you will see that, as I just mentioned, that the lion's share of the cost comes from the crew-related costs, and hence the greatest saving from layup decision is because you will leave only the skeleton crew, and the rule of thumb is you can save about 75% of the operating costs by doing so. Now this is an example of direct operating costs of a 5-year-old 75,000 deadweight Panamax bulker. You will see that there is barely any difference between the two. I mean, it's quite logical. Essentially, it doesn't take more crew to run a vessel with 20% more capacity than the handymax. Essentially, the cost component remains very much the same. Okay, so now for a second I'd like you to think like an owner, and hopefully that will enable you to understand where the floor is coming from. These are the options of an owner in a depressed market environment. Essentially, you can keep the vessel idle, as many owners do in Singapore these days. You can lay up the vessel or operate the vessel. Now, as I mentioned, okay, we just use the example of the handymax. You can either lose $4,700 per day, or if you decide to lay up, you're going to lose $1,200 per day, or you can operate the vessel. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, as the economist, we have to keep everything constant. Just look at that. So, can any of you tell me, what do you reckon the minimum daily earnings will have to be in order to break even and justify operating the vessel? Any hints? Sorry? How much, sir? No, I mean, you have an option. Okay, you can keep the vessel idle. You're sitting at anchorage in Singapore. You're losing $4,700. Okay, the other option you have, you can lay up the vessel. You're going to lose $1,200. Now, my question to you is, at what daily earnings level you're going to break even? Well, 3,500, very good. Who was that? Oh, okay. Okay, well, that gentleman is from the shipping industry, so understandable. Now, obviously, there are long-term and short-term considerations. I mean, obviously, as I mentioned, this analysis is looked at holding everything constant. If you're an owner, and if you were to break even and deploy the vessel over the long term, then a particular trade, you will have to, besides everything else, incur the operational risk. So normally, over the long term, theoretically, owners would ask a premium. They would never deploy the vessel at the break-even because it doesn't make sense. You say, if you have a situation whereby you can just lay up the vessel on the one hand, and on the other hand, deploy it and incur the risk, obviously you would choose the former. But the short-term considerations are different. As the gentleman from Maersk explained, laying up the vessel involves certain upfront costs. It's a long-term decision. You cannot just essentially freeze it and on a short-term notice deploy it in the market. Therefore, in the short term, as long as owners believe that depression of the market has a short-term character, they would be willing to operate the ships even below break-even level. And well, if you look at selected fixtures reported at Baltic between October and November, you will see some amazing levels. We discussed yesterday. A Cape fixed at $12.50 per day. A Panamax fixed at $3,000 per day. A Handymax fixed at $2,000 per day. I mean, these levels are way, way below the reg operating cost. Now, having said that, if owners at that point of time had reasonable grounds to believe that the market were not going to turn around in the short to mid-term, they would have never agreed to deploy the vessels at those costs. Okay, so let's try to put what we've discussed about supply, demand, and cost on the hockey stick economics graph and see how all of those factors interact with one another.